Interrogative negative sentence. Sentence structure. Hadn't plus subject plus been plus V4 plus other words. Hadn't I been writing for quite some time? Hadn't we been writing for quite some time? Hadn't you been writing for quite some time? Hadn't he been writing for quite some time? Hadn't she been writing for quite some time? Hadn't they been writing for quite some time? Affirmative sentence. Sentence structure. Subject plus V2 plus other words. I wrote a letter. We wrote a letter. You wrote a letter. He wrote a letter. She wrote a letter. They wrote a letter. Negative sentence. Sentence structure. Subject plus didn't plus V1 plus other words. I didn't write a letter to the principal. We didn't write a letter to the principal. You didn't write a letter to the principal. He didn't write a letter to the principal. She didn't write a letter to the principal. They didn't write a letter to the principal. Interrogative sentence. Yes or no type questions. Sentence structure. Did plus subject plus V1 plus other words. Didn't I write a letter? Didn't we write a letter? Didn't you write a letter? Didn't he write a letter? Didn't she write a letter? Didn't they write a letter? Interrogative sentence. WH type questions. Sentence structure. WH word plus did plus subject plus V1 plus other words. Who did I invite to tea? When did we invite them? Why did you invite your friends? Where did they invite us? Interrogative negative sentence. Sentence structure. Didn't plus subject plus V1 plus other words. Didn't I write a letter? Didn't we write a letter? Didn't you write a letter? Didn't he write a letter? Didn't she write a letter? Didn't they write a letter? Affirmative sentence. Sentence structure. Subject plus was or were plus V4 plus other words. I was writing a letter. We were writing a letter. You were writing a letter. He was writing a letter. She was writing a letter. They were writing a letter. Negative sentence. Sentence structure. Subject plus was or were plus not plus V4 plus other words. I was not writing a letter. We were not writing a letter. You were not writing a letter. He was not writing a letter. She was not writing a letter. They were not writing a letter. Interrogative sentence. Yes or no type questions. Sentence structure. Was or were plus subject plus V4 plus other words. Was I writing a letter? Were we writing a letter? Were you writing a letter? Was he writing a letter? Was she writing a letter? Were they writing a letter? Interrogative negative sentence. Sentence structure: was or were plus subject plus not plus V4 plus other words. Was I not writing a letter? Were we not writing a letter? Were you not writing a letter? Was he not writing a letter? Was she not writing a letter? Were they not writing a letter? Affirmative sentence. Sentence structure: subject plus had plus V3 plus other words. I had written a letter. We had written a letter. You had written a letter. He had written a letter. She had written a letter. They had written a letter. Negative sentence. Sentence structure: subject plus hadn't plus V3 plus other words. I hadn't written a letter. We hadn't written a letter. You hadn't written a letter. He hadn't written a letter. She hadn't written a letter. They hadn't written a letter. Interrogative sentence. Yes or no type questions. Sentence structure: had plus subject plus V3 plus other words. Had I written a story? Had we written a story? Had you written a story? Had he written a story? Had she written a story? Had they written a story? Interrogative sentence. WH type questions. Sentence structure: WH word plus had plus subject plus V3 plus other words. What had happened the whole night? Why had you plugged the flower? How had she worked? Where had they gone for exams? Interrogative negative. Sentence structure: hadn't plus subject plus V3 plus other words. Hadn't I written a letter? Hadn't we written a letter? Hadn't you written a letter? Hadn't he written a letter? Hadn't she written a letter? Hadn't they written a letter? Affirmative sentence. Sentence structure: subject plus had been plus V4 plus other words. I had been writing for quite some time. We had been writing for quite some time. You had been writing for quite some time. He had been writing for quite some time. She had been writing for quite some time. They had been writing for quite some time. Negative sentence. Sentence structure: subject plus hadn't plus been plus V4 plus other words. I hadn't been writing for quite some time. We hadn't been writing for quite some time. You hadn't been writing for quite some time. He hadn't been writing for quite some time. She hadn't been writing for quite some time. They hadn't been writing for quite some time. Interrogative sentence. Sentence structure: had plus subject plus been plus V4 plus other words. Had I been writing for quite some time? Had we been writing for quite some time? Had you been writing for quite some time? Had he been writing for quite some time? Had she been writing for quite some time? Had they been writing for quite some time?